Welcome back to our series of audio lessons on the book of Esther. Today we'll look at chapter 2. Before we get into chapter 2, let's take a quick look at what happened in chapter 1. In chapter 1, we saw Xerxes throw a big party and a big fit. He's hosting a large banquet for all the power people in the kingdom to gain their support for an invasion of Greece. He commanded his queen, Vashti, to come to present herself to all the attendees, and she refused. We talked about why Vashti may have refused to come when the king sent for her, and the very plausible idea was put forth that Memucan's extreme reaction may have been a result of disagreements between Vashti and Xerxes' advisors. They saw this as an opportunity to get rid of her once and for all. Some scholars believe that Vashti and Amestris, that's a queen of Xerxes mentioned in the ancient texts, are the same person. Herodotus describes Amestris as a cruel despot, a jealous and vain person, just the kind of person to have run-ins with the advisors. Vashti in Persian means beauty or goddess, and considering her vanity, she may have given the nickname to herself. Xerxes' advisors may have taken an unfair advantage of him. At the banquet, the compulsion rule for drinking was waived, meaning you could drink as little or as much as you wanted. If Xerxes was drunk and the advisors, especially Memucan, had more of their wits about them, then Memucan's hyperbolic claim of how Vashti's actions had insulted the whole kingdom and bringing it to ruin would have been presented to Xerxes when he was in a very vulnerable state, angry and drunk. Herodotus wrote that the Persians would deliberate about the gravest matters when they are drunk, and what they approve in their councils is proposed to them the next day by the master of the house where they deliberated when they are sober. And if being sober they still approve it, they act thereon, but if not, they cast it aside. And when they have taken counsel about a matter when sober, they decide when drunk. One commentator described it as the drunk leading the drunk. Memucan presented the remedy for Vashti's refusal as so urgent that Xerxes didn't wait until he was sober to decide. After his ill-fated agreement with his advisors, Xerxes exiles Vashti for someone better than she, someone to be determined later, and sets off to conquer Greece. Memucan's idea of someone better was one who would be more in agreement with the council or more controllable by the council. Now on to chapter 2. Let's begin with reading verses 1 through 4. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the capital, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. And let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. The chapter begins, "After these things." Well, what things? 3 years have passed, and Xerxes has returned home from his defeat in Greece. I don't think his anger is directed at Vashti and what she had done, but over his inability to take Greece. He's basically pouting. Now he's had a chance to remember Vashti. Does that mean he had forgotten who she was or that he had been married to her? No. It means that he thought about what had been decreed against her. The verb used for decreed is a passive voice verb, meaning no blame has been assigned to anyone, certainly not Xerxes. It's something that just happened to her. Here may be the source of some of his anger. The language implies remorse, compassion, even regret. One person said, regret is insight that comes a day too late. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, says he would have taken her back, but the laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be altered. So what can we do? What's to be done about the king's melancholy? This time is not to his advisors that Xerxes turns. His advisors aren't even mentioned, causing some to think that after musing about the events surrounding Vashti, he realized they had failed him miserably and gotten rid of them. In fact, he doesn't turn to anybody. They come to him. His personal servants, those who, after the deposed queen, know him best, come to him with a simple suggestion: find a new queen. All the translations I've read render these persons as servants or personal attendants. The ESV has young men who attended him. The word in Hebrew is feminine plural, causing one commentator suggests these are young women. And knowing the workings of Xerxes' mind, suggests young, beautiful virgins be brought before the king. Theoretically, Xerxes' search for a new queen was limited to the 7 royal families in Persia, but this search is open to all in the kingdom. Why abandon tradition and law to open it up? It may be that after deposing Vashti, Xerxes had had enough of the 7 royal families and the intrigue that accompanied them. Or, as one author suggested, maybe his new advisors knew what the females of the royal families looked like and knew they needed to expand the pool. The search for a new queen was not some romantic tale out of Arthurian legend. Far from it. Look at the verbs used. Gather, sought, bring. This is not an advertisement in the Susa Daily Mail calling for willing volunteers for the Queen of Persia pageant. The officials went from province to province, town to town, village to village, culling out only the beautiful girls to bring them to Susa. Did they go willingly? No doubt some did. Could they, like Vashti, have refused? Only if they wanted the same fate as she. They are to go through a beautification process and present to the king for his choosing. Let's look at verses 5 through 11. Now there was a Jew in Susa, at the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was beautiful in figure and lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in the custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Enter Mordecai. He is described only as a Jew. He is a 4th-generation exile. Some detractors like to point to this as an historical inaccuracy and thus attempt to dismiss the entire book. They claim the who in the phrase, who had been carried away from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, refers to Mordecai. This exile was in 597 BC, and the events now occurring in Esther are in about 480 BC. Even if taken into exile as a baby, Mordecai would now be 117 years old. Not very likely. The who obviously refers to Kish, the Benjaminite. Who else do we know to be a Benjaminite associated with the name of Kish? King Saul, and this will be significant later. Mordecai and Esther live in Susa. She had been orphaned. The law of Moses had protections for orphans. And in Exodus 22, beginning in verse 22, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. Mordecai, her first cousin, went beyond the law's requirements and took it upon himself to bring her up as his daughter. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, says he wanted to take her as his wife. Since he had a position in the king's service, some suggested he was 35 to 40 years old. Esther, described as a young woman, possibly would have been less than 20 years old. Esther's Hebrew name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle. Esther is Persian for star, and some associate it with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. It's not uncommon for exiles to be given or adopt foreign names. Mordecai, from the Persian god Marduk, likely had a Hebrew name, but it's not known to us. There are some other examples in the Old Testament. Who were Belteshazzar, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Belteshazzar was Daniel's Babylonian name, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are better known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Whether Mordecai tried to protect Esther is not known. One Targum, that's an ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew Old Testament, says he indeed tried to hide her, but it would have been difficult with the king's men looking for beautiful women. But we can deduce that her participation was not voluntary. She was taken as a result of the king's order and decree and placed under the custody of Hegai. Esther is described in various versions as beautiful of form and face, had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, lovely and beautiful and lovely in form and features. She pleased Hegai and won his favor. So what was it about Esther that pleased him and won his favor? We don't know for sure, but we can look at it. What's the difference between winning favor and finding favor? Both of these phrases are used in the book. When the Hebrew idioms are used, finding favor implies passivity. Winning implies activity. She was doing something. She was active. She probably didn't want to be there, but once taken, she was compliant. She followed Hagai's leads and suggestions. She was not so active as to blend in with some of the other girls who might have been there for gold diggers. I've never seen the program The Bachelor, but from the trailers it's not hard to figure out the premise of the show. Esther would not have been like the women on that show, actively almost cutthroat trying to get the bachelor to choose them. She would have been obedient, demure, modest, helpful to all the girls. It says so in verse 15. She may have been the ancient version of Miss Congeniality, the designation for the woman who is friendly and helpful to all others, but usually not the winner. But in this instance, she had inside help. Because she had won Hagai's favor, he gave her the best of everything available to prepare herself for meeting with the king. Cosmetics, portions of food, 7 maids from the king's palace, probably from the harem, and the best place in the harem. That may mean a physical location within the harem complex, or that Hegai got to choose the order the women saw the king. Hegai was actively promoting her for new queen. And who else than the keeper of the harem to know the king's taste in women? He knew what Xerxes liked. Twice in this chapter we are told that Mordecai had instructed Esther to not reveal her people or kindred, and she had not. Why would Mordecai so instruct her? Well, first it suggests that there was in Persia an undercurrent of anti-Semitism. If she revealed herself as a Jew, it would have been very detrimental to her. However, there's no indication in ancient Persian records of anti-Semitism. In fact, the Persians had some degree of disdain for all their subjugated races. Secondly, it suggests that the Jews in general, and Mordecai and Esther in particular, had assimilated enough to Persian life to be indistinct from the rest of the population. They were both born during the Babylonian captivity. Jews who kept the dietary laws and the customs of speech, behavior, and dress required by the law of Moses would certainly have stood out. This may be why she didn't protest the breaking of the dietary laws as Daniel did. Mordecai telling Esther not to reveal her being a Jew implies that from casual observation, the officials in Hegai would not have known. Even if they had lost their outward distinctiveness, it is clear throughout the book that a trusted God is still there. Being in captivity, they had to scale back their worship. They were far removed from the temple. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the origins of synagogue worship may have begun during the Babylonian captivity. While Mordecai and Esther do not give us the same example of faith as David, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, comments from both reveal a knowledge that God is in control and he will protect them. If not Mordecai and Esther personally, then the Jews as a whole. This section ends with Mordecai keeping a daily vigil on Esther's progress. From whom did he get his daily update? Well, probably Hegai. Why did he want to check on her every day? Well, she was his adopted daughter, and he obviously had concern over her. He was aware of her fate if she had not been chosen queen. The odds of her being selected were slim. Presuming that at least one beautiful girl was found in each of the 127 provinces, at least 127 to 1. Now that she had been taken away from home and consigned to one of 2 lives, queen or the consignment to the harem, he might as well hope for the better of the two, queen. Besides, having a Jew as queen could go a long way in improving their lot. Perhaps there were already rumors of a second return that could be hastened by someone whispering in Xerxes' ear. Let's look at verses 12 through 14. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into the king Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under regulations for the women, Since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went to see the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in the king again unless the king delighted in her and summoned her by name. Okay, now comes the disturbing part of the story, interviewing for the position of queen. The girls were in preparation for this interview for 12 months. Cosmetics, oil of myrrh, spices, ointments, special food. I don't know what each of these was supposed to do for them, but it was a strict regimen. They were to be beautified from inside out and outside in. The word translated cosmetics in verse 3 can also be rendered purification. This is not the same word meaning the religious purification of the law. The root here means to make clean or bright by rubbing, to polish. This was the same process Daniel had to undergo and would have included learning the Persian language, customs, and laws. Many of the girls may have already known the language, customs, and law, but they would have had to be schooled in the court etiquette of women. Some of the women, especially from the less refined provinces, may have needed some polishing before they went before the king. Some of the beauty treatments were meant to smooth out the rough spots. 12 months was a quarantine period that would allow for any latent disease or blemish to be healed and cleansed before meeting the king. On the day they were called, they would take with them anything they wanted from the harem, clothes, accessories. This was not a talent competition and an evening gown display followed by a swimsuit promenade and a question how they would help the children or seek peace throughout the empire. Remember, there were only 2 qualifications. She had to be beautiful and she had to please the king. They had already been selected because of their beauty and had 12 months of improvements. Now came the pleasing of the king. She would go in at evening and come out in the morning and be immediately swept away to the rest of the concubines, never to be seen by the king again unless he called for her by name. The harem area in the palace was obviously too small for the place to hold all these women. There were so many women that a second, more expansive harem building was needed. In verse 14, it says that they left the king's presence. They went to the second harem under the charge of another eunuch in charge of the concubines, where she would remain for the rest of her life, to leave only when the king called for her. She was a virtual prisoner. Verses 15 through 20. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning in favor in all those who saw her, and when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Now it's Esther's turn. Again, when she went to the king, she could take anything she wanted. What did she take? She took only what Hegai advised. Why? Hegai was the keeper of the women. We mentioned this before. Of all the people in the kingdom, he knew what the king liked. Esther had won Hegai's favor, and he was doing what he could to get her selected. Many commentators, reading between the lines, believe the other women went before the king highly adorned with impeccable makeup. By contrast, in her modesty, Esther took only minimal accessories and no makeup to allow her natural beauty to show. Esther was successful in winning the favor of all who saw her. I think that probably includes the other women. Maybe she had endeared herself to them so much that they were rooting for her too. One thing we do know for sure, she won favor, grace, kindness, approval in Xerxes' eyes, and he loved her more than the others. She is now the new queen. What was it about her that so enamored her to Xerxes? According to additions to Esther in the Apocrypha, again, not inspired, Esther was subject to fainting spells. When she stood before Xerxes, she became overwhelmed and fainted. According to the Midrash, Xerxes kept a statue of Vashti beside his bed and compared each virgin to it. He found Esther superior to it and placed it with a statue of Esther. Stop the competition. No need to proceed further. We found the new queen. Xerxes was about 55 when he was assassinated in 465 BC, which makes him about 40 now. Esther was probably late teens, early 20s. The date is recorded, the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, in the 10th month, Tebeth. Tebeth is related to the Hebrew word meaning to dip or to sink, thus the month of sinking in, or the muddy month, because of the heavy rains that fell during the month. Esther is crowned. Xerxes now throws another party, a banquet in honor of Esther. I get the impression this was not something he did for Vashti. Not only is there a banquet, but Xerxes gave gifts to the people and proclaimed a tax holiday. I wonder if they all ran to the malls to buy things because they didn't have to pay sales tax. The commentators who took a stab at this seem to think this was a ceremonial parade to show off the girls involved in the selection process, followed by Esther. When we first meet Mordecai, he is described as a Jew, nothing more. Now Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. This is not to let us know he had a good vantage point to see the parade. Sitting at the king's gate implies he now holds a position in the king's government, possibly due to Esther's influence. The author again gives us some insight as to what made Esther so special. She is now Queen of Persia, the greatest empire in the world at the time, and still not revealed her people or kindred. She has not done so because Mordecai has instructed her not to, and she is still obedient to Mordecai, just as she had been when he was bringing her up. Let's finish the chapter. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. This came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate again, possibly in his official position. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan, probably the same guy as Bigtha in chapter 1, verse 10, and Teresh, they plot to kill Xerxes, and the plot becomes known to Mordecai. The threshold they guarded was that of the king's sleeping apartment, so they had ready access to him. How it becomes known to Mordecai, we're not told. Maybe he overheard them making the plan. One commentator supposed that Mordecai may have been overseeing something like the king's secret police. If that's the case, you would think the eunuchs would have known to be away from Mordecai when they began talking about something like this, so nothing would get back to them. Mordecai just happened to be the one to whom the plot was reported. Another official may have presented the information himself to the king to grab the honor, or not told the queen and joined the plot. Anyway, Mordecai tells Esther. Esther tells Xerxes, giving the credit to Mordecai. An investigation ensues, the plot is confirmed, and the conspirators are hanged. This was not by a rope as in the westerns. They were either crucified or, more likely, impaled on a stake. It was the result of just such a plot that Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BC. All of this is duly recorded in the Chronicles in the presence of the king and forgotten for now. In the introduction, we talked about how the book of Esther was not just about a little Jewish maiden who became queen and saved the Jewish people from destruction. I think it's more than that. It's about God's providence. Where, in what we've seen so far, do we see his providence being revealed? Are there events we've seen so far, or are they just a bunch of coincidences? Let's look at some possibilities. The compulsion rule for drinking had been waived, which means Xerxes may have been drunk, and his advisors may have been not so drunk. Then you had Vashti's refusal. Normally, a command for the king would be obeyed. Memucan's accusation was very extreme. During the battle, Xerxes' superior forces were defeated by Greece. Esther was taken for the Queen of Persia competition. Hegai was in charge of the women, and Esther was winning his favor. Another eunuch may not have been so impressed with her. Regarding that, 4 times in chapter 2 we see words pleases, won favor, winning favor, grace and favor. All of these are synonymous with grace, suggesting God's grace working through this scheme. And then there's Hegai's advice to Esther to take with her to the king, and Mordecai learning of the assassination plot. As already said, another official may have had a quite different response. In all this, I see God working in the background. Well, that'll do it for chapter 2. Next time, we'll look at chapter 3. Until then, may God bless you.